Because when we are weighing the cost and the benefits of whether or not to have police in schools, you have to consider that psychological piece. You have to consider the trauma, and you have to consider the effectiveness. What the research shows is that, as we've seen by anecdote, but the research shows that police presence doesn't prevent a mass shooting, but instead it increases trauma, as we've already said. It also increases referrals of children to court systems. It also leads to more school dropouts for normal adolescent behaviors. And then more school dropouts means what? More crime in the community, right? And there are a couple of things that I think is worth talking about. The origins of police in schools, and then let's come back and talk about how do we keep kids safe. I, like so many people in this country, bought into the often repeated narrative that we have police in schools today because people were afraid, teachers, parents were afraid to send their children back to schools after the mass shooting in Columbine, Colorado in the 1990s. But when I began to do research for The Rage of Innocence, I realized something that I should have known, which was that the first police in schools appeared in 1939 in Indianapolis in response to the earliest conversation about even the possibility of integrating schools. Again, fast forward to the Civil Rights era, and we see that police presence in schools increases exponentially during the Civil Rights protests. And in large part, right, the narrative was we're sending police in schools to facilitate a safe passage of children, Black and brown children, into integrated schools. But we know from the historical record and from the iconic photographs that far too often police became an impediment to true and meaningful full integration of schools. Fast forward again to the early 1990s, 1991, we have the National Association of School Resource Officers is founded. That's a full 8 years before Columbine ever happens. Fast forward to 1994, that's when we have the Federal Cops in Schools framework is created. That is the framework that would allow the federal government to funnel money into states and ultimately to local school systems that will agree to hire police in schools. That's in 1994. Again, we're still 5 years in front of Columbine. And then, indeed, Columbine happens in 1999, and there is an increase in funding of federal money for cops in schools programs. But where do those police officers get sent? They get sent to schools with a disproportionately high presence of Black and brown students, right? They don't get sent to the Columbines in droves and the Sandy Hooks in droves. So it's really important for us to understand that racialized history when we talk about police presence in schools. It's not in a vacuum, right? We didn't just wake up and decide. And it is not accurate to say that we have police in schools solely in response to the mass shootings that were previously. I mean, what we find is that police in schools actually undermines, in many ways, the school climate. And I want to be clear. Yes, there are many friendly officers who go into this profession and ask to be assigned to the school framework because they care about kids. But guess what? The research and the data shows that the vast majority of police officers who are in schools are not adequately trained to work with teenagers. They're not trained in adolescent development. They're not trained in the psychosocial features, fancy word. They're not trained in the key features of adolescent development. They're not trained in de-escalation strategies. What do I mean by de-escalation strategies? What would the best parent do? What would the best teacher do? What would the best neighbor do to respond to, intervene in normal adolescent behavior? And instead, officers are trained in police academies. And so when they show up in the schools, right, there might be a memorandum of understanding. Most times that memorandum of understanding is about how funding will be allocated. It's not about the allocation of whose responsibility is it. Is it the teacher's responsibility, the behavior specialist's responsibility, the principal's responsibility for normal adolescent discipline? Or is it a police officer's responsibility? And what we see in school system after school system is that officers, unfortunately, are being drawn into routine discipline. And the research shows that those kinds of interventions are more traumatic than helpful. That's what we talk about when we're talking about undermining school climate. Really important to understand. And why is that so important to understand? This trauma piece and the school climate piece and the school climate piece, especially for Black and brown children, because when we are weighing the cost and the benefits of whether or not to have police in schools, you have to consider that psychological piece. You have to consider the trauma, and you have to consider the effectiveness. What the research shows is that, as we've seen by anecdote, but the research shows that police presence doesn't prevent a mass shooting, but instead it increases trauma, as we've already said. It also increases referrals of children to court systems. It also leads to more school dropouts for normal adolescent behaviors. And then more school dropouts means what? More crime in the community, right? So we're doing ourselves a disservice. All I urge is for folks, when they're thinking about whether or not policing in schools is the most effective strategy, is to weigh that against the pros and the cons. What does the empirical research show about effectiveness? And then what are the harms? And then is there something that is more effective? And the answer is yes. I advocate for, and as do many, a public health approach to both school safety and community safety. So what does that look like? Public health approach, number one, is attentive to the relationships between adults and children. It's also racially equitable. It's restorative in the sense that it seeks to restore relationships that have been impaired, and it is trauma informed. So what does that look like on the ground? It looks like a continuum of mental health services for children in the system. Again, not stigmatizing and culturally competent. It means peer mediation. It means restorative justice frameworks. It means vocational training. Here's really important. It means social emotional learning in the curriculum, helping children understand how to engage with one another, have empathy and compassion and emotional intelligence. All of these things are really important for teenagers as they grow up, and we don't do that. So there is an answer to this. And that public health approach, if we would invest in that, meaningfully invest in it, and not go running the second that there is some tragedy. These programs have to be fully funded, and we have to allow for trial and error. What often happens so often is that we'll say, okay, you're giving me this evidence-based strategy. We're going to try it for 60 days. And then if it doesn't work, we're done. Or they go in saying we're going to do it, but 60 days later, something happens and we give up and we walk away from the strategy. And that's what's really problematic. But there's an answer.